This is a short study on Genesis chapter 37, the lectionary reading set for next Sunday, the 9th of August. If you get a chance to read the passage before you listen to me, that would be really helpful. And please do remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's free and it will give you notifications of any further things that I post. So this chapter, chapter 37, is the beginning of the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob. It extends over several chapters, and next week we'll look at one of the much later episodes in his story. Perhaps the story is familiar to you, not least because Andrew Lloyd Webber popularised it in his musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's difficult to see this part of the story in isolation from the rest, as so much of what it has to say comes from the much bigger, overarching story. In this part of the story, God doesn't even get a mention. The love of Jacob for his son Joseph is almost eclipsed by the predominance of hatred, arrogance, and dysfunctional family relationships. All the time when we're reading this early part of the story, we're aware that many things could have turned out very differently in the long run, not just for Joseph or for his father and brothers, but for the whole of the human race. And so we can see God at work behind the scenes, if not explicitly mentioned, preparing and providing for Jacob and his family. The first 4 verses are the foundation of the story. They set the scene, reminding us that the story of Joseph is actually still part of the wider story of Jacob. And we're aware of family tensions right from the start. The narrator refers to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, 2 of the wives of Jacob. Yet we know from earlier chapters of the tension and rivalry surrounding Jacob's 4 wives and their provision of children for him. We know that Joseph is the firstborn son of Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel, and as such he would naturally have been the target of jealousy and animosity. We can ask, why else would the narrator mention a detail about genealogy if that wasn't a factor in the relationship between Joseph and his brothers? There's a bit of confusion too, I think, around the timing of the story. Verse 3 reads as though Joseph might be Rachel's only son. We don't know from this passage whether Benjamin has been born or whether Rachel is still alive. A couple of chapters before this story, in chapter 35, we do read that Rachel dies after giving birth to Benjamin, but it's not altogether clear how the chronology of that whole genealogical passage fits in with the story we read in chapter 37. However, in verse 10, Jacob's rebuke of Joseph does suggest that his mother might still be alive. In these first 4 verses, we begin to understand something of Jacob's favouritism. It's made quite clear in the gift to Joseph of a long robe with sleeves. The coat of many colours that the King James Version describes is actually based on a misreading by the Septuagint translators. The detail of the coat is apparently important enough to be mentioned. In Hebrew, it means something like a long tunic reaching to the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. A similar item of clothing is mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 8, suggesting that it's a very fine garment and that wearing it gave a person certain honours. Although not directly stated, the mention of the robe seems to imply that it gave Joseph a sense of superiority and privilege. This is seen in verses 5 to 11, in which Joseph tells his brothers about 2 of his dreams, where he is the object of attention and admiration and everyone else is bowing down to him. Joseph comes across here as arrogant and antagonistic. This causes his brothers to hate him all the more. And at this point, the brothers' animosity is made evident to their father Jacob, even if he wasn't aware of it previously. In verse 11, we read that Jacob kept the matter in mind. This might make us wonder why Jacob sends Joseph out to look for his brothers in verses 12 to 17. It seems perhaps to give us another indication of the preferential treatment that Joseph gets. We know from the earlier verses that he's 17 years old and helped the brothers shepherd the flocks. So we wonder, why has he been let off the hard work on this occasion? Or perhaps he was skiving, but Jacob found him and decided to send him out to them anyway. At first it seems like a bit of a wild goose chase. Joseph goes to one place, Shechem, but they're not there. He's redirected to Dothan, which sounds as though it's some distance away. And as readers, we might wonder how long this kind of evasion will go on. Joseph finds his brothers at Dothan, but they see him coming from a long way off, and they hatch their plan. Perhaps it's already been something that they've talked about in quiet moments when Joseph wasn't around. They really can't stand Joseph anymore. They have a plan to cause his death without putting any suspicion on themselves. It's thought that this chapter might combine at least two different versions of the story of Joseph, because there are some details that seem to be repeated, but with differences. The first is that in verse 21, Reuben steps forward to save Joseph's life, but then in verse 26, Judah does the same thing. In the story as we have it in front of us today, Reuben's initial intervention would have only delayed his death and not saved him. Joseph probably wouldn't have lasted very long in a waterless pit in the desert. So Judah's intervention goes further. Although the outcome is by no means secure, the chances of Joseph not dying in slavery were not much better than the chances of his survival in a pit in the desert. And this is where there is another difference in the story. In verses 25 and 27, we read that the Ishmaelites take Joseph to Egypt, whereas in verses 28 and 36, we read that it's the Midianites who do this. As readers who probably know the rest of the story, spoiler alert, we can understand the irony that Joseph's salvation ultimately ends up sparing Jacob and his brothers too. Although God is not mentioned at all, and we don't get any miraculous rescue by a redeeming angel, if it wasn't for this part of the story, the whole of the story of Israel, and therefore also the story of which we're a part as Christians, could have been tragically different. God's presence and grace is evident if we read between the lines and keep our focus on the bigger picture. If you'd like to think about this a bit further, then here are some questions you might want to consider. So read through this chapter again, and if you have time, read on a bit further into the story of Joseph's time in Egypt. Think about the kind of rivalries that you've experienced with siblings and family members, or friends and work colleagues. How does that make you feel? How do you respond to the idea of Jacob's favouritism? How far do you think Jacob bears responsibility for the events of this chapter? Who is missing from the story? What do you think Jacob may have thought about Joseph's behaviour and the tricks of his other sons? Do you think that at any point he sees history repeating itself in the deception of an elderly father? What do you think Rachel would have thought about all of this? What hope can you identify in this part of the story which seems to be so full of hatred and destructive behaviour? Are there any places in this chapter in which you can identify love and grace?